Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'd like to welcome our guest speaker, Sami Khatib, who would be giving this lecture as part of the project Measuring Life, Notes Toward an Impossible Exchange, which was developed or conceived by Dar al-Funun in the aftermath of the pandemic and features a series of invocations that interrogate systems of value embedded in hegemonic representations of life and the economy. Sami Khatib is a cultural theorist and philosopher. His research spans the fields of aesthetic theory, critical theory, visual arts, media theory, and cultural studies, with a special focus on the thought of Walter Benjamin. He holds an MA degree in media studies and philosophy and a PhD degree in media studies from Free University Berlin. He is a founding member of the Beirut Institute for Critical Analysis and Research. His ongoing research project, Aesthetics of the Sensuous Suprasensuous, examines the aesthetic scope and political relevance of Marxist discovery of the commodity form. Prior appointments include a professorship of visual arts at the American University in Cairo, a postdoctoral fellowship at the DFG-funded research training group Cultures of Critique at Leibniz University, a visiting professorship of philosophy and aesthetics at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, a visiting professorship at the Department of Fine Arts and Art History at the American University of Beirut, and a Mellon postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for Arts and Humanities at the American University of Beirut. Welcome, Sami. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Sami will be speaking for 45 minutes, after which we will be opening up the space for conversation and questions and answers. And yes, thank you very much. Sami, you can start whenever you're ready.
Yes, thank you, June. Thank you, Firas. Thank you for having me. I'm going to talk 45 minutes and you please interrupt me after 45 minutes. It looks a bit bigger, but I try to do. Basically, I try to just think with the curatorial statement and connect it to my old-fashioned attempts to always and always again read Capital Volume 1. So as you said, I'm still trying to do that. It is next to me. And I'll read the paper. It's kind of dense. I might comment on a couple of sections. I will also share a couple of quotations from this handout from the talk. And as I saw, some of our guests I know. So those who know me and know maybe my research, bear with me. Some of what I'm saying sounds slightly familiar, hopefully better than in earlier attempts. So the impossible measure, life, death, and real abstraction. And please let me know about the sound. Sometimes you will hear a Berlin police car making itself known, but this was the only room that has best internet. Sorry for that. So the impossible measure, life, death, and real abstraction. One disclaimer I should actually add, this talk is informed by a couple of workshops and talks and Q&As I benefited a lot from. One of them was actually a class on real abstraction at Ashkal Alwan in Beirut, and also a forthcoming publication on undead labor that soon will be published. I'll share the particulars maybe after the talk. That also helped me a lot on basically the contradiction or the relation of zombie-like labor power and vampire capital. That will be in the end. Okay, but let's start with my first, let's say, considerations or reflections after having read the invitation and the amazing, really brilliant statement of this project. So my talk begins with a very naive and simple assumption or question. What is the measure of life? Of course, this invites all esoteric nonsense. But today, most of us would agree it is the economy, it's capitalism, and most of us would also agree that this measure is utterly flawed, wrong, and doomed to fail. The capitalist measure of life is impossible. The standard of its measurement is classist, racist, sexist, ableist, exclusionary, and you can add many more. Moreover, what counts as life, once life is validated by economic value, is itself a contentious political issue, probably as old as capitalism and its foundational ideologies, liberalism and humanism. But how then can this impossible measure be so productive? How can this measure and all the negativity it mobilizes, you may think of war, violence, exclusion, permanent crisis, and various forms of oppression, function and self-propel itself by virtue of its failure? In my talk, I will revisit the battleground of life, death, labor, and capital through a rereading of Karl Marx's notorious labor theory of value, most prominently outlined in Capital Volume 1 from 1867 and then ongoing later editions 72. Thereby I will comment on the strange, if not uncanny, contemporaneous of his text that keeps on haunting capitalist relations of production and reproduction for more than 100 years. Actually, I should also make a reference here. We had a conference in Ramallah in Birzeit in late 2018 on Marx, the uncanny contemporary. How are we still reading this text now for 150 years? Hopefully not for the next 150 years. Then we are done with capitalism, but we're still doing it. And how and why? So if the measure of life is capital, this measurement, of course, has a history. This history already starts with the question, what counts as life? For the sake of brevity, I have to bracket the implications, corrections, rebuttals of Marx's labor theory of value and assume that the modern Western mobilization and politicization of life, basically what Foucault called governmentality and biopolitics, is implicit to Marx's somehow overdetermined notion of human labor and labor power. If we think of Marx's feminist critiques of Marx, most notably Silvia Federici's account in Caliban and the Witch, we cannot ignore that the white male working body was first produced by excluding and exploiting the unpaid labor power of feminized reproductive labor. Furthermore, the historical production of labor power, that is the violent separation, isolation, and abstraction of labor power cut off from the land and means of production, could not have come into being without the history of slavery and colonialism. Bracketing this history of racialized violence, I also bracket the violent history of capitalism's so-called primitive accumulation, the destruction of the social relations of the European Middle Ages, and the destruction of non-European forms of life. So in fact, the history of capitalism presents the primal scene of an ongoing counter-revolution. In other words, the uneven and combined development that installed capitalism in Europe from the 16th to the 19th century proceeded as a counter-revolutionary history, a victor's history against revolutionary movements, beginning from Thomas Münzer and the peasant wars of the 16th century, and the slave rebellion on Haiti, and the failed European revolutions of the 19th and 20th centuries. This counter-revolution is still present and ongoing in the shape of the capitalist world market that prompts and forestalls struggles for decolonization. And of course, not dealing with this violent history comes with a price. The danger of presenting capitalism as an ideal form, a purely logical form of a commodified social relation that somehow works itself through history. In what follows, I'm not attempting to argue for such an ahistorical, abstract critique of capitalism. Rather, in reconstructing the historical mode of capitalist real abstraction, I try to outline the dynamics of an impossible measure that in its failure also lays bare the history of cracks, gaps, and conflictual battlegrounds for political intervention. On a categorical level, this dynamic is addressed in the dialectics and asymmetry of capital and labor. This is basically my very, very long disclaimer of what I should have done, but I couldn't do, of course, in 45 minutes in order to end or start with the first line of Capital Volume 1. Basically, the unfolding of what is the commodity. And there, in the first chapter, Marx's basic argument seems simple at first sight. I mean, labor creates value. Value is somehow revalorized as capital. But however, there is a logical, also historical and temporal complication implied in this sequence. Labor as concrete labor, be it manual or intellectual labor, and of course you will say they're always combined, is measured by time. And time is not immediately value. This measurement is impossible. The mediation of this impossibility, however, is productive. So this is basically the paradox I'm dealing with. Time is money, money is time. No, not really. And why this is not so, and what is the mediation that is needed to make this asymmetry and mismatch matching is, if you want, explained in Marx's first chapter of Capital, and also something that still motivates or mobilizes the historical trajectory of capitalism today. And how far is something we may discuss in the Q&A. So in societies in which life is treated as the commodified bearer, the vehicle, if you want, the shell of the commodity of labor power, life is constantly being measured and valorized as economic value. While labor power, or the potentiality to be productive in the economic capitalist sense, ultimately remains immeasurable, the expenditure of labor power can be measured. If, in the last instance, all economy is an economy of time, time becomes the measurement of life. To be sure, in capitalism, money can buy labor time. However, time is not money. With the introduction of the wage system of labor, capital's life gets caught between the impossible exchange of time against money and capital. Living labor is mortal. Capital is undead. This intrinsic mismatch is both productive and doomed to fail. It stretches life beyond death, turns living labor into undead labor, and takes on the shape of a catastrophic history of violence. But how did we get there? Let us remember how Marx unfolded his argument. His entry point is the split or dual nature of the commodity. And that's very famous. I just recall this for those who are not familiar with the book. So basically he says there's use value and exchange value of a commodity, but it's a unity, use and exchange value. Whereas use value seems unproblematic as long as it refers to an empirical thing. It could also be a function, or it could be a mathematical thing. It could be an intellectual thing. It could be a code. But it is still something that satisfies a determinate human need. It can be used for something. Huh? So it doesn't seem problematic at first sight. On the other hand, exchange value is something more untouchable, you can say, or immeasurable. It expresses an abstract social category, economic value. And that comes later with a price tag. So exchange value here is understood in Marx as the appearance of value. It designates the merely quantitative value relation of one commodity vis-a-vis another commodity as a relational difference. From the presentation of the dual nature of the commodity, Marx then quickly moves on to the next categorical level of redoubling. So remember, we have a split. The split has two sides, and then the whole machine of dialectics is started, and we have the next level of redoubling, and that is now on the side of labor. The labor that produces a commodity has also two sides, concrete and abstract labor. While use values are produced by concrete labor, measured by concrete labor time, or let's say chronometric time that says now 5 p.m. 17 Berlin time, the very act of concrete production also produces value. So it's not just time, there is value being produced, but how is this value being produced? How is this measurement? How can you calculate that? Value is produced, as Marx says it, by abstract or abstract human labor, which exceeds linear chronometric measurement. However, in real time, these two acts of productions are the same. Abstract labor designates a social relation between different expenditures of labor power, maybe yours and mine, materialized in the results of this expenditure, what we produce or how we can exchange our products. Put differently, the concrete use value dimension of labor does not come into being independently from its abstract value producing dimension. So it's not attached through financialization later. Inherently, while producing concrete labor, I also produce abstract value. However, the point is to what degree I do that. I partake in it, but I don't know in what measure and what is the measurement of which. However, on the market, though, they appear as two independent, if not antagonistic entities, concrete and abstract labor, endowed with a life of their own. The commodity exists as a commodity thing and as money. One appears as a concrete thing, the other as an abstract token. However, and this is maybe Marx's main theoretical discovery, both are real. You cannot say money is just a sign conventionally agreed upon, and if I burn it, it's gone. Of course, I can also become a hoarder of money, and it can be devalued, and I can't do anything against it. Of course, many of us experienced that quite recently. Explaining the peculiarities of the value form in the original German 1867 edition of Das Kapital, Marx introduces an intriguing image, and that is unfortunately then later left out in the later English editions and also in the later German editions. I have used this image almost in every talk, so I apologize to those who hear it again, but I just love it so much. And this is Marx. It is as if alongside and external to lions, tigers, rabbits, and all other actual animals, which form, when grouped together, the various kinds, species, subspecies, families, etc. of the animal kingdom, there existed also, in addition, the animal, the individual incarnation of the entire animal kingdom. So the abstract concept, the animal, exists along and next to all really existing animals. So it's not made up, it is there. And without saying too much already, I mean, this is basically the dimension of value that is later expressed in money. It is not just an intellectual abstraction from those tigers, rabbits, and other animals. No, the animal exists along with them. That is, you can say this is one way of understanding what is meant with redoubling. How is this animal then real and abstract at the same time? Of course, you can say the animal is abstract. It's an abstract concept of all animals. In capitalism, it is as if the mode of abstraction, namely value, has a real material existence of its own, independent of the human mind. As one really existing animal encounters another really existing animal within the animal kingdom, in capitalism, it is as if concrete sensuous objects, products as commodities, encounter their mode of abstraction in real life, namely money. Following the logic of this image, the incarnation of such abstraction is in fact real. It is not the result of a subjective intellectual operation, you may say an illusion, but rather the effect of an objective and actually existing social relation. So to repeat, the animal, of course, is not really existing as something you can touch. However, it has a really existing materiality, and also material effects in such a social relation. That's why the image is so instructive, and it shows actually the redoubling of money and commodity. So again, money is not just an abstraction from commodities. It exists next to them, and they also both have value. So as mentioned before, grasping the nature of real abstraction basically comes down to the question how we understand the substance of value, and that is abstract labor. And of course, that's one of the major challenges and discoveries and innovations of the book. In fact, Marx's distinction of concrete and abstract labor is ambiguous and invites misreadings. You can say it wasn't clear to Marx himself. That might actually be true. Marx himself defines abstract labor also as the expenditure of human labor power as such, instead of focusing solely on the fact that abstract labor expresses the totalizing exchange relation mediated through and by money of all expenditures of concrete labor in a given capitalist society, which is of course ultimately the world market. There are passages in Capital Volume 1 where Marx seems to define abstract labor as, and I quote here, socially necessary labor time. And of course you say, who can determine that? Some computer or what? Or as expenditure of human labor in the physiological sense, as essentially the expenditure of human brain, nerves, muscle, and sense organs. Again, who should measure that? And I think against these formulations, we are to insist on the purely social and differential relational nature of value and its so-called substance, which is another relation, abstract labor, which again cannot be measured objectively by time and space. It can be measured objectively, but not by time and space. And that makes it so difficult to unfold. Of course, you could say, if I had all the data of the world and all the expenditures of labor power that there are in the world, if I could even figure this energetically, or how much carbohydrates are being burned or whatever, could I measure actually what each and every one living, even beyond human life, is doing, and then say this is the value of which? According to Marx, that's not possible, because there is a historical and logical retroaction going on here that needs to be unpacked, and that probably that also is something why that book stays with us, and why the refusals or rebuttals of Marx's value theory of labor again also seems so ambiguous, and actually call for more investigation rather than assuming that this issue could be solved and settled. So why is the abstraction introduced by abstract labor really existing, and not just an abstraction in theory, or in mind, produced by the critical mind of a theorist like Marx. Basically saying Marx has invented the animal himself. I mean, it's just in the mind. The animal is not really existing. You could also say that if you were a positivist or an empiricist or a good nominalist. So in his reading of Marx's Capital, the German philosopher Alfred Sohn-Rethel coined the term real abstraction, which has recently become quite fashionable, to my surprise, but why not? And this term characterizes an abstraction from use value actually performed by economic agents in the act of commodity exchange, whether they know it or not. It's not an intentional one, like I use a commodity only as, you know, the means of my economic success, and abstract from the very particularities or whatever, or I use your labor power not because I like your work or whatever you personally. I'm just interested in your labor power that I can valorize as capital and treat it as a pure means of, you know, capital investment. This is not meant by it. There's something kind of unconscious going on in that very act of real abstraction, while exchanging, again, it's an impossible exchange, but it is done, exchanging commodities for money, here labor power for wage. Something is done, really performed, that Sohn-Rethel would call real abstraction. It's not just an abstraction in mind. Following Sohn-Rethel, the coin, or the money sign, is the historical as well as logical origin, not only of commodity exchange, but also of the modern Western form of subjectivity. That is to say, its intellectual categories and forms of intuition, which, yeah, good old Immanuel Kant identified as time and space. So not even time and space are neutral now. No, there's not an absolute measurement. Of course, for modern physics, that's not really news, but maybe for Marx. Real abstraction is not limited to the economy, but structures the logical and aesthetic forms of cognitive knowledge and experience. In this way, the coin is not just money in the instrumental economic sense, but also the logical origin of everything that since the ancient Greeks is considered as koinos, common or general. Money designates the coin, ordinary token, commonly accepted sign of economic value, and the shared common structure by which the subject's cognitive and experiential faculties are structured. The capacity of spatio-temporal intuiting, perception, and the faculty of apprehending the manifold and determining its general features by means of intellectual abstraction. Of course, everything that goes by the name of measurement. And as Alfred Sohn-Rethel put it, and I'm quoting here from the only one that had been translated into English of his books, it's called Intellectual and Manual Labor. And there he writes, it's just a three-liner, time and space, rendered abstract under the impact of commodity exchange, are marked by homogeneity, continuity, and emptiness of all natural and material content, visible or invisible. Visible, invisible, he also says basically air. By the way, I hear always cars here. Is it loud? Okay. Time and space, as a priori forms of intuition, are abstract in a very specific sense. They function as empty ahistorical containers for empirical events. It is in this sense that they assume the status of timelessness and universality, and thereby repress their socio-historical origin that is rooted in the commodity form and the history of real abstraction. Such formal abstractness of time and space is to be differentiated from empirical abstractness of concrete appearances in time and space, which are also dehistoricized under the impact of the exchange abstraction. So we have to distinguish here between two acts of abstraction, and that's not the same. So we have the historical The historical traces of production, class struggle, you may say, the exploitation of labor power, and so on, they are erased in the clean act of commodity exchange as the results of the application of labor power. And second, within the commodity, concrete use values are treated as contingent appendixes of abstract value. So one, you can say, is basically the structure of historicity and how we measure time, space, which is a product of that very historical social relation that also goes by capitalism. And the other one, you may say, is a kind of conscious or unconscious, intentional or unintentional relation to things as commodities. I treat this, even though I like it maybe, but I treat it only as a mere, vehicle or bearer of value. But these are two different things. And of course, the first one, the categorical level, is the more tricky one, because you can say that real abstraction to this degree is the structuring, the structuring condition I'm always already born in, time and space. That's how I learn, in the beginning at least, mathematics. That's the way of how I maneuver myself in this world. And as a result, real abstraction is not in symmetrical opposition to concreteness, but refers to an unconscious, intersubjective practice that produces the semblance of the universality and timelessness of the aesthetic and logical categories modern philosophy is so proud to speak about. So it's not to dismiss Kant or to dismiss Descartes. It is to smuggle a kind of inconvenient historicity, it's the historicity of capitalism in the end, into their philosophical, seemingly logical and pure theories. That doesn't make them wrong, but gives them a different weight or a different status. So again, what is abstract about abstraction in this sense here, in the sense how Sonredel reads Marx? It is the enforced repression of negativity, the effacement of the uneven and discontinuous history of antagonistic struggles. This repression as social practice has real effects that pertain to both the formal disappearance of material traces in value, money doesn't stink, and the empirical liquidation, extraction and transformation of concrete labor into abstract labor, then into value, and then, in the last instance, temporalized as capital. So in other words, abstract labor and the real abstract nature of time and space are codependent. So it's not, that's the economy and that's maybe physics or philosophy. As a result, time becomes the dominant social relation in capitalism. In Capital 1, Marx pointed out the asymmetric relationship of concrete and abstract labor time, and there's a whole chapter on that, the struggle on the normal working day. I just read one short passage. The prolongation of the working day beyond the limits of the natural day into the night only acts as a palliative. It only slightly quenches the vampire thirst for the living blood of labor. Capitalist production therefore drives by its inherent nature towards the appropriation of labor throughout the whole of the 24 hours in the day. Of course, in today's more, let's say, digitalized capitalist relations of production, this is no news. We know this is a 24/7 capitalism, and we also know that thanks to our digital infrastructure, also talks like that, we can be at any time during the day, more or less in any place that has internet, and we can be measured there. We can we can expand we can do the expenditure of labor power, and there is no natural limit to it. Of course, you can say that the 24 hours of the working day, remember it was the struggle for 8-hour working day back then, So when the 24 hours of the working day present an absolute limit for the production of the absolute surplus value, as money as you can, as value as you can extract from someone working for you, the production of the relative surplus value can rely on the temporal and spatial intensification of value per given time limit. Basically, you can enhance and increase the productivity per time unit. So capital's undead, as you put it, vampire thirst for the living blood of labor, and one should take this metaphor quite literally here, transcends the boundaries of the normal working day and chronometric measurement. The uncanny temporality of surplus value indicates the transition from the substance of value, again, that was abstract labor, to the subject of self-temporalization beyond the chronometric measurement of spatialized units of simple or average labor. Swallowing and digesting living labor, the dead labor of value transforms itself into the undead labor of surplus value, and that is capital. Ultimately, capital's undead temporality pushes the limits of the working day beyond physical death and the material needs of living labor. As Marx put it, here quite literally, capital is dead labor. But we have to talk about the temporality of this deadness that I earlier on called already undeadness. And here I quote again from Marx's Capital. Capital has one sole driving force, the drive to valorize itself, to create surplus value, to make its constant part, the means of production, absorb the greatest possible amount of surplus labor. Capital is dead labor, which vampire-like lives only by sucking living labor and lives the more labor it sucks. The time during which the worker works is the time during which the capitalist consumes the labor power he has bought from him. Him here, the old male laborer, but you can say from them, the workers, globally. Of course, you will say, is not all automatization in one attempt to decrease or to limit the labor time involved, necessary labor time involved in the production process? Of course it is. And that's precisely what creates the density, the productivity and efficiency of labor time unit. And the more this is done, of course, the more relative surplus can be produced. So having said all of this, we have to remind ourselves here, what is then capital? Marx defines capital, again, as the self-valorization of economic value. And capital, as we have heard, is not a stable or consistent object, it's something I can touch, but a movement, a trajectory, an unstable social relation, of course, that goes by permanent crises. This accelerating movement needs surplus value, a value that is intrinsically more than what it is. And here we are at the paradox, basically a logical and temporal paradox. Surplus value, what is that? Is this Marx fantasy or does this exist? And I guess that also the understanding of surplus value could tell us something about the vampire thirst or the temporality of this vampire thirst of capital that swallows a certain substance which seems to be living labor but cannot be measured. In the end, it is. I mean, until death, it is also chronometric time, but it is something of a time different from what I can measure with my watch. So how can something be a surplus of something that has no stable ontological consistency or ground, and whose existence solely relies on becoming more than what it actually was, or rather than more than what it will have been? As you know, of course, capital is always speculative. It starts with zero, with debt, and has to make a bet, a wager on the productivity of which it is invested for. So the surplus, if there is no surplus, there is no value. That's the strange thing. So if you normally say surplus value, say a surplus of the value that was there before. What I have, I mean, from the entrepreneurial perspective, this is my capital. Money, it becomes capital the moment I invest. Of course, also in labor power, but also in machinery and automatization and so on. But here, in this logic and in the sum total logic of what actually abstract labor means, it is something that is inherently more than what it is. It is not an add-on to something which was there before. And probably this is, as a footnote, Marx's strongest critique of the social democratic fantasy that there could be a just wage. There is no just wage. Every wage is theft. Every wage is exploitation. A good or better degree of exploitation. We fight for that, but it is it's a structurally exploitation. I know we are on 42 and I'm talking way too much, but let me do one more passage, and we can more clearly see what is the logical and temporal paradox of that measurement that comes in through capital. Also in the book, until now, we are more in kind of static levels of split and redoubling. Now with capital, we are in movement. And the movement is something, or let's say when Marx explains or unfolds the logic of this movement, also all the related parts of this movement are moving and transforming themselves. So that's why a linear presentation, once upon a time, and then this and this and this, is impossible. That makes the text also, that creates the vertigo of the text. So for Marx, capital comes only into being through a differential relation. It's no solid ground. It's no stock that you can actually share. A differential relation without fixed or static relata. Surplus value expresses the ever-changing difference, or mismatch, you can also say, of the value of labor power and the value generated through the application of labor power in the production process. The value of the commodity of labor power finds again its standards in the costs of its reproduction, and hence also in unpaid reproductive labor. Here, the entire sexist but also racialized nature of the production of labor power is implicit, and there are many critiques of Marxian critiques of Marx who pointed to this. Actually, one I mentioned earlier, Silvia Federici. What appears as a surplus on the side of the capitalist who employs labor power appears as a loss on the side of the owner and seller of labor power. Of course, historically, the wage, even white male wage laborer. Surplus value implies the extraction of surplus labor time. Yet while being equated, time and value are not equal. You don't know what is the surplus. Otherwise, I could also say, this is my favorite social democratic fantasy. Okay, it's exactly 6 hours. I have worked exactly for my salary. Bye. Of course, this would be the total utopia of today's office work culture. If you said, no, it's done. It's exactly now that I can go home because my labor power was from here till there. And now I reproduce my labor power. Of course, that is complete 70s fantasy. And it was a fantasy back then already. But today, it's at least, that's not funny, actually. It's also sad. Loss and surplus do not express loss and surplus here are not symmetrical in reciprocal relation. That's so strange. Reciprocal to a certain degree, but also not depending on perspective. So capitalism is not a zero-sum game where you have some stock you can share or steal. Of course, that's all happening. But as a whole, capitalism is not a zero-sum game, but it's also not simply a corrupt casino that you could close and keep capitalist relations of, labor power production intact. So financialization is not an add-on. As we shall see, surplus value acquires a life of its own as capital, which represses the dimension of loss and exploitation of surplus labor in a very specific way. And of course, that alludes to my very long disclaimer of what I had to bracket the violent history of how capitalism came into being, and also what is today's reality of class struggle. So mapping time onto value is only possible by way of redoubling the commodity as commodity and money, as we said earlier. Without the money form, surplus value could never come into being and be measured. And as many scholars have argued, money is not merely an instrumental or a secondary mediator of commodity exchange, like the fantasy of barter or simple commodity exchange. I repair your bike, you can cut my hair, or you give me this, or I give you that, and then we formalize and put money as an instrumental mediator there. No, that's not. That is also what money does, but not all. In capitalism, money constitutes the measurement, mediator, means, and method of commodity exchange, without which there would not be any value, surplus value, or capital. And that's very important. The three, the measurement, the mediator, you can also say the means or the medium, and the method of commodity exchange. And that it is a bit like rephrasing Marx's earlier image about the concrete animal and the animal that is also on stage, the animal as the incarnation of all other animals. In actual capitalism, there is no such thing as simple commodity exchange, where money only functions as an external mediator of exchange. Even if you do so, you participate in exercising the function of mediation and of value, of capital, and you apply the method of money in its function of becoming also capital. Even if this money is, just, I can actually burn it if I take it away, if I take it out of circulation. As soon as we are in a society in which the capitalist mode of production prevails, money functions as capital too, and again, even beyond my intentional will. That is to say, the method of money consists in treating money as money in its pure and, Marx says, fetishistic self-relation, and in treating commodities as a fleeting, transitory materializations and embodiments of value. And in reverse, value only exists if value will have been produced in commodity exchange. Commodity production and exchange must produce surplus value, and without surplus value, there is no value either. So surplus is originary, or put differently for Marx, surplus or loss, depending on perspective, surplus comes first. This is basically the redoubling of debt comes first, if you look from the entrepreneurial side. It is original on a categorical level. Value is being produced only if surplus value will have been produced. And one more sentence, this mismatch, asymmetry and ontological inconsistency is immanent to the drive of capital, and in theory can be presented in terms of a logical retroaction within the temporal sequence of capital accumulation. In capitalist reality, however, this unresolved conflict, you can also say impossible measurement, takes on the uncanny shape of a monstrous entity. Here I stopped. The last part is actually only what are the beautiful metaphors that Marx uses, actually not so beautiful. It's basically the vampire thirst. And Marx introduces it himself, actually, this kind of living beyond death, or living of other people's life beyond their death. Capital is dead labor. And in the last part, I talk about, I used a couple of, actually I used Stranger Things 3, I told you, these popping up rats in that defunct old steelwork factory. To point at abstract labor, basically it is about zombie labor power, the class war in, what is class struggle in the realm of undeadness, vampires against zombies. But that I leave for another day. And of course I use The Monsters of the Market, this amazing book by David McNally. It's on zombies, vampires, and global capitalism, really recommended. But I rest my case here, and let's do, we can talk about this maybe during Q&A.
Thank you very much, Sami. Okay, so maybe we can open up the floor, like you said, to Q&A. Anyone who wants to ask a question can type it down and we can communicate it to Sami. In the meantime, maybe we can start reflecting with you to give people the time to write down their questions. Maybe we can actually return to this question of the measurability or immeasurability of life as a start, and reflect on it in light of the pandemic moment, which is something that was very much present in our statement. You know, like we refer to this, the dominant modes of representation used to signify lives saved and lives lost, and what to make out of that in terms of this like conversion of life into a computable or calculable entity. And then there's like this wider context that is not necessarily specific to the pandemic, but also has very like sort of similar implications. That is the example of the exponential rise in biological patents, and the fact that the human genome right now is in the process of being privately owned. So like another example of this like commodification of life. So I was wondering whether we can reflect on this in relation to the current moment, this like sort of proliferation of graphs, statistics, curves, denoting this impossible measure, which doesn't seem to be very impossible. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I should maybe clarify one thing. The condition of measurement in capitalism is, strangely, it's very immeasurability. What is being measured, everything can be measured in capitalism precisely because this measure is a flawed one, is a mismatch. Mm-hmm. And this mismatch is, or every measurement proceeds from immeasurability. Mm-hmm. So, and that's of course a problem. If I have a vitalist understanding or a humanist understanding of saying, look, I sell my labor power 8 hours a day, but now I'm a human, right? No, it's actually worse. So exactly what you think is your essence as outside of the measurement is much more the resource of further commodification, and that you care for it so nicely by saying, this is my essence, you know, that is exactly where future relative surplus value will be produced from. And that we have now, you're at home here now at my in my own library, which is my sleeping room as well. So that I have made classic reproduction center into production side. Okay, you say this is semiotic capitalism, this is normal, we know this already for a long time. But the pandemic shows us only that any kind of mismatch, when you say capitalism must be done, finally we got him, we got it, now, you know, nobody can go to work. And still, the very failure of measurement, which is a systemic failure, it's not like I can't go the 8 hours to my office anymore, all the better. So there is no kind of absolute failure here, or some kind of hindrance or obstacle. Rather, all of these obstacles, problems, immeasurabilities are turned into further increasing of productivity. And how actually capitalism has reacted to the pandemic is amazing to see, also uncanny to see. And I don't know how many of the formats that we are doing now will survive that crisis. We don't know. Maybe there will be a commodified, for sure, vaccine on the market, and maybe it works, and we can all go back to work. Sure, but we have never left the factory. That's so sad.
We'll never leave it.
I don't be so pessimistic, but
but actually, like yeah, like adding, it's really cool, like how you put it now, like that the place where you basically reproduce your production, I don't know, you reproduce yourself, your labor, and etc. Now it turns to be part of an extension actually of the factory, and yeah, like where you sleep is actually where you work. For a lot of people, it's amazing working from home. And also like it's really funny also to see how governments all around the world, they were promoting this as like very fun thing, you know, like there's kids around playing, and I don't know, like how people like have their funny lives on Zooms and everything. But also there is this, of course, this fetish going on around this whole medium. This whole also like trying to transform. I mean, capitalism is, yeah, it proves itself all the time, like as like it builds itself. I mean, like how we said also earlier, like its success comes actually of how it overcome how it's actually how you say, like benefits out of crises, no? Like crises are part of this whole machine, let's say. And yeah, I was just thinking also like of earlier, also before we started conversation, we're talking about like I don't know if you followed, but like 2 days ago, NASA and SpaceX, they successfully launched their Falcon 9 to the ISS, to the International Space Station. And they also, of course, promote it as very intersectional, rest in peace, racism, all this kind of, you know, like basically liberal Hillary Clinton kind of politics, with like the first black man entering the ISS, etc., etc. Which also like, it's funny in itself, like how this whole theater play and this sign value that was also like, I mean, Baudrillard again jumping, but like how it was produced, but then like less than maybe 8 hours later, which was the time that the Falcon 9 needs to arrive, I mean, this mission needs to arrive to the space station, Jeff Bezos on his Instagram account, which also like is very important to note that Jeff Bezos has Blue Origin, which is the competitive of SpaceX, but it seems it's very failing. So like he announced a $10 billion fund. It's called like Earth Fund or something like this, like Save Earth. This kind of like approach toward climate change and saving our planet. Now we have to save our planet, of course, etc. But it's, you will see like this kind of competition that's going on there, but also like these fake futures are being, how they are being sold, and also like how people are like in general. I mean, it's like it's culture industry, like there is this cultural industry that is going, and even though that like how a lot of people at the very beginning of the pandemic, people that were saying like capitalism is dying, capitalism is dead, there is no work this Monday, etc., etc. But apparently, no, capitalism just reproduced itself, and it's zombie. I don't know actually if zombie dies, but yeah, zombie die at some point, will die, I guess, with the yeah.
No zombie films, they always kill the zombie through here either a headshot or heart is for the vampire, I guess. But but it was meant the zombie, your labor power survives in the products that you have produced in a zombie-like nature that is repressed. And I don't know how this systemic class struggle of two undead temporalities, vampires and zombies, is played out. But these are the doppelgangers that our existence produce while being alive. These are the doppelgangers through the measurement trace that we leave behind us. You can say your zombie is your zombie existence is the likes that you have ever done on Facebook, or the digital trace that we have just produced here. This can be, of course, further monetarized. And of course, it can be that has an existence, an afterlife. And that I meant by zombie nature. So you are not in charge of your zombie, let's say, abstract labor nature. And the temporality of that is beyond you. We will all die, but what we have, of course, I always hope that the clicks that we did on internet will not survive our death, but there will maybe, and they will in some way be mediated and will live on. It's a horrible, really, it's an infernal fantasy that our, as you said, value science expenditure, whatever that uncanny temporality is, obviously not the one of mortality and watches and clocks, that they will survive our death. And there's a systemic need for it. That is meant by the vampire thirst of capitalists, not the vampire thirst of capitalists. This would be the old, the Nazi anti-Semitic fantasy that capitalism is just, a couple of old dudes, No, it's systemic swallowing in of that and transformation into a self-valorization. That, of course, is important that you point at Baudrillard, that we should not fall into the traps, the loopholes of Marx's book, that actually could also be read as there is some real labor, productive labor, and then there is these useless intellectuals like us who talk to a screen. Of course, we produce labor, and we even get paid for it, strangely. And there's good news and bad news in that for sure. But one more thing, I can imagine that especially after this pandemic, there will be a kind of nostalgia for, of course, never good old, but let me add it, good old alienated labor. Yeah, because if you have never left the factory, think about, would it not be nice to be in another place to work, something completely idiotic I have no investment in, like really something I don't like, I don't like, but I don't care. I just do this and get a paycheck, and I go out there, physically out, and if I have a cell phone, I throw it, and that's it. I come back on Monday, 8 o'clock. I do what you want. That's not how it will work. If capitalism had stayed on that level, it would have finished, of course. And so I see the pandemic as an accelerationist moment in capitalism. And I think we will also stay with these technologies that are already there, but are intensified now. Absolutely, I think so.
We have a question from Diana Al-Halabi. Diana is saying, I would love if Sami can expand on how every wage is theft, no matter how high or low it is, and what is the intellectual exploited body in the capitalistic machine?
Of course, I used Proudhon here against Marx. It was polemical. I said theft not in the individual level. Of course, you can be overly exploited and less exploited. Maybe if you're in a union, you're less exploited. But I meant that exploitation in the transfiguration or transubstantiation from concrete labor to abstract labor, from labor power, living labor being applied in the production to what is later then capital. There is a systemic exploitation. There is unevenness. This is a systemic unevenness or asymmetry. You can never bring this together. If you could, then money would be time. Then I could actually make it even. And this would be the moment you can do that, capitalism would cease to exist, because value would exist and not surplus value. The point was, capitalism is an exchange of equivalence which is uneven. That's the weird thing. It's an equation mark that is like that, or cut. And the moment it really matches, then end of the story. And that would be great. So the moment you get, so there's also a kind of a utopian side in the social democratic fantasy of a just salary, which is not exploitative. Then capitalism would cease to exist. But of course, you cannot do that, because then you are not having labor power as a commodity that you own. I mean, you own your labor power also means that labor power owns you. Then it's a completely different relation. it's not private property anymore that you sell on a market. And the other one was about the intellectual labor that was, I talked
the intellectual, okay. And what is the intellectual exploited body in a capitalistic machine?
Intellectually, I mean, we are intellectually, mentally, manually, I mean, all, I mean, we are exploited. But I didn't mean this in a moralizing sense. I just mean exploitation is a systemic need. Otherwise, without exploitation, there is no labor power applied, and no labor power is no capital, after all. And then we are in a different society. But I haven't said that internet communism is not possible. I haven't said that. I'm just a pessimist, but.
On that, maybe actually I can read you another question from Sanabil. Sanabil asks, I'm wondering about how time and its devalue would be situated within communist cosmism, where efforts of achieving Soviet post-humanism, such as resurrection and rejuvenation, practiced in methods such as blood transfusion, were thought of so that the Soviet state would be able to present to its citizens the most valuable entity, time, by making people eternal. So if the production of time is taken on by a communist government, does this change the value or lack of it of time as opposed to the capitalist market?
Yes, amazing. I would like to call Oksana Timofeeva my comrade in this moment, but ask her this. It would be the victory over mortality. It would be the victory over mortality, the ultimate apotheosis, the ultimate victory of capitalism, which would immediately leap into and fall into communism. Accelerationist friends out there may agree or not agree. Or is exactly that fantasy the ultimate capitalist dystopian fantasy that if this happens, I mean, I don't know. I just find this I just find that fascinating, and many of the early Soviet Union avant-gardes, also literary production, cosmism. This is fascinating. This is something to study, not only as some bizarre Soviet Union side production of intellectual content that nobody was interested in. No, it is a very, very precise analysis of the symptoms of capitalist modernity against which the Soviet Union rebelled. But of course, there is an affirmation also on language as infrastructure, as means of production. So what if we could overcome mortality and our if we would be basically the zombie, and we would get rid of the zombie because the zombie wouldn't be a doppelganger anymore. It's not the double anymore. It's the original. Would this be the failure of capitalism, or would this be the end? Would we then eternalize capitalism? Let me just only say one thing. There is one parallel dystopia against that. Think about Walter Benjamin's reference in Arcade's Project, second edition, I think 39, when he discovers this insurrectionist, Auguste Blanqui. And Blanqui wrote this book, L'éternité par les astres, so eternity through the stars, that everything that has happened had already happened before. There is only, I don't know, 90 elements of the universe that aleatorically can be combined and so on, and there will, in infinity of time, will also infinity rehappen again. And this he throw at those who were the victors against him, who won. He is the vanquished, and he said this to capitalism. Benjamin says it's this kind of infernal vision that also could bring down capitalism. If this eternal repetition of the same would really be unleashed, because you can also say eternal repetition, eternal affirmation. Think about it. Blanqui, Nietzsche can also be understood as anti-capitalist here. And you can say that capitalism is just the regulation, the limitation of eternal recurrence of the same money, commodity, money, commodity, more money. Yeah? And maybe Russian Soviet Communism could be one way of accelerating this logic in capitalism, which is parallel actually to Blanqui, and thereby also, you know, let these doppelganger political economy of time implode on its own terms. Oh, I love it, of course, but it's way too interesting to not get lost.
Great. Okay, so we have another question from Yusuf Al-Bushi. So Yusuf asks, seeing capitalism as a continual counter-revolution, what does effective revolution aiming at abolishing capital itself look like in contemporary terms, given the extended geographies of the global market, both physical and digital?
Yeah, I mean, the extended existence of the global world market can be read in two ways. Capitalism can also regionally survive, but also capitalism can be attacked from any point. So if you succeed at a certain moment in a certain region, maybe for a certain time, to decommodify land and labor power, and therefore life, to a certain degree, you will not fully succeed. You also have to interact in the world market. And if this could set an example, and if you could connect with so the same bad capitalist infrastructure that has been put in place digitally, and if you could have that, which may be at a point where that might be possible, could this be the end of, I don't think there will be a great, maybe only in ecological terms, a big bang theory for the end of capitalism. I think there might be a gradual decommodification of certain parts of life, because through capitalism is not sustainable, whatever you do. And there's a certain, let's say, absolute limit to the economization of failure when it comes to ecological questions. I could imagine that as a kind of self-defense, communism as self-defense, something like that, like para-communist pockets within capitalism. But of course, it's very difficult. We have seen all of those examples or experiments have immediately been crushed, immediately, with the most violent interventions that we have seen. And not so much about, it was never so much about the real economic loss that was, or the threat of losing a very small market. What is in there? No, it is the fear of the example, that this example could spread, and the example that people actually could live and could maintain living without reproducing themselves through selling their labor power. This is something of the most dangerous thing also to capitalist leaders. And there's a lot of, fascist ideologies that can be mobilized today, and it will be unleashed on those who try that. And we see this all over the globe. And I don't know, I hope, but and I still see it in a positive sense, that I think if there is no real center, as a polycentric world of capitalist markets, there are also more moments to attack. And an attack doesn't mean the old attack. It also can mean to make dysfunctional for a certain mode of surplus value production. This would be already enough. And there might be also some other, let's say, tendencies within the world market that can actually counter current forms of capital accumulation. Can be devalorization. Of course, it's also then crisis, which is horrible. But maybe I'll leave it there.
All right. So we have another question from an anonymous attendee, asking, how do we escape this undead temporality that surpasses everything despite the vastness of what capitalism can do, is it still a question of power?
I hope it's still a question of power. But who is the subject of this power? Is the power already given to the zombie doppelgangers that are living next to us, that we have everything that we have, our, not energy, but all the labor power we have already expended here and lives on as the zombie doppelgangers of our existence, immeasurable, measuring the immeasurable, and then valorized by capital. Is this the power I have to fight, or could I? Now, yeah, of course, now I sound a little bit obscurantist. Or could I conjure the specters of these doppelgangers and align myself with these zombies, my own zombies that I've here created just in the last 45 minutes? And could we join our power? And then we would still have kind of an agency. I think one study a lot zombie films because it's a very good immanent critique of American consumer capitalism, and we see that this kind of consumer capitalism is, crumbling, is in crisis. So maybe we should also analyze the dystopian immanent critique of that. Yeah, the end of the American century. It's already has been declared many times, but I think we can safe to say so now. Yeah, I don't know where the power is actually, but I still believe so, because otherwise we don't need to do politics. We can also just say, let the undead temporality swallow us. We all meet in hell, or not. I mean, our doppelgangers at least.
Right. Maybe actually, until we get more questions, I can share with you a quote. I mean, you shared with us very interesting quotes tonight, so I thought I'd have you reflect on one of the readings that very much influenced the way that we conceptualize this project. So this is one from Ashida Membe. So it goes, as we speak, many bodies already fall beyond the scope of calculation unless we reinvent the terms of what counts and in the process signify what value stands for, as well as the procedures of assigning value, of measuring value, of exchanging value, things won't change. These are some of the key questions any decolonization project worthy of its name must address.
Yeah. There are two things. We can change the mode of calculation and what is being calculated. Of course, you can also have intersectional capitalism in the end, but ultimately that's not what we want. So what was then the problem of capitalism? It's one problem of capitalism is that each and every stage of capitalism will calculate in a certain way and has a certain hierarchy there. But in an almost Hegelian fashion, that's so uncanny. Yeah, like this old Depeche Mode song, everything counts in large amounts. And that's the nasty part. So if you tell me, but my history should also count, sure, it counts, but it counts as negativity. And that's the negativity that fills the battery of capitalism. It's not that my failure and death doesn't count. It counts, but not in a way that I want that. It counts as, you can say, yeah, the metaphor, being swallowed by this vampire thirst for living labor, or that which enables the living labor to be reproduced, even on negative terms. So even your negativity, your death, and your not participating in world history counts in a very uncanny way. So how can I make this counting different? Or maybe I don't want this counting at all anymore. Or how could I do, and maybe then I sound very old Benjaminian. Benjamin had this idea about Spiel, playfulness. Could we have something of a calculation that doesn't count? You know, something where we experiment, and even my failure wouldn't count, at least in a certain moment. because we would say we have to withdraw from the total calculation of the world market and try out different forms of calculation and also a playfulness with calculation. I think we cannot get rid of calculation altogether. There will be a social mediation. And remember, I don't understand him as an intersectional capitalist. He's against the global world market. I think he is for something else. So it is not about making capitalism more accountable for its wrong calculations. That is not meant by decolonization. Decolonization means to make capitalist reproduction of labor power impossible, because it needs always people that are excluded as slaves, as Marx called it, primitive accumulation, just destroy your life form and throw you in the world market so that you only have your skin and your labor power to sell for whatever. This is original accumulation that is wherever there is war. And so it is a different mode of calculation, of calculating, and maybe also different mediation where the modality of calculating is a different one. It's not a matter of life and death anymore.
Great, thank you for expanding on this. This was great, actually. We have 2 more questions. So, is this zombie undead double an ontological value or a projection that we can do away with at the end of the day? Only a few of us have the luxury of the undead, while most are disenfranchised.
The disenfranchised have also their doppelganger and zombie as negativity. And that's the sad thing. If the disenfranchised would just be out of world history, then we could start from scratch. But as I said before, also as negativity, as non-participant, you participate. And this is the totalitarian logic of that. And of course, ontology, hauntology, everything is full of Derrida in this library, and I forgot it. But probably you will say, this Derrida stuff. No, I love him, of course, but let's not go into spectral science, hauntology, ontology. Of course, every ontology is haunted by an hauntology, and there is no Geist without Geister, and so on and so on. No, it's not just a joke. I think if we could get rid of these specters, let's call it more neutral specters, of these doppelganger existences, even through the negativity of our life, then it would be easy. Because it's not just our successes count, our failures count. And the failure is actually the stuff out of which the reproduction of living labor power is facilitated. So if I could just go back and I'm just a loser, I just don't participate anymore, then even my non-participation facilitates in a mediated way. And that makes it so, I would say, how can we do exodus without leaving? How can we do an regional exit? Or how can you get out of this totalitarian temporalization loop? How can you get out of that? And I have no answer to that. I just try to understand the text that I think points to that problem. And that's also why we're still reading this text. I wish a society in which where we don't have to read Capital Volume 1 anymore. But maybe we have a playfulness of ghosts, a playfulness of, now I said ghosts and zombies is not the same, of course, but maybe where vampires are in the zoo.
All right, so maybe we will take one last question, and after that we need to close, unfortunately. So this is a question from Jose Rosales. So he says, the time proper to surplus populations is, as Marx recognized, that of disposable time. Interestingly enough, in the Grundrisse, Marx identifies disposable time as the true source of wealth. The question, which is undeniably hard and can ultimately only be resolved via revolutionary praxis, is how, by what means, and where can surplus populations with their labor that doesn't get the chance to die transform their concrete time of immiseration into the temporal individuation of communism as the real movement.
Oi, there, I think I think Jose is right anyways. I mean, one thing about the true source of wealth, the disposable time in Grundrisse, I would say you can say that this one is one of the utopian parts of Marx, or where you can actually have a social theory of a revolutionary practice, this disposable time. But the disposability of that time would probably also break the logic of that time. You know, the time that you in Grundrisse, this earlier study before Capital, Volume 1, Marx said also that the real realm of freedom has to be built on the realm of necessity. And it all depends on how do you read that. I think necessity we won't get rid of. And wait, I will. But the point of surplus population points to everything which could be a source of liberation or emancipation. Disposable time becomes a further enslavement or a further mode of domination and oppression in capitalism, because as the bearer or as the one who has disposable time and is not bearer of living, of the commodity of living, of labor power, you're rendered as trash. You're dumped in capitalism, and your disposable population, you're unproductive, and you will be treated like that. And which at the same time would be great, because if automatization allows for better organization of production, yeah, bravo. We don't have all to work so much. I mean, that is what I take from that. But I have to seriously, I have to reread and also write an email back. Yes.
All right. So maybe we can close, since we're actually reaching the end of this talk. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for the very thought-provoking questions. Thank you, Sami. It's a real pleasure, and hopefully next time we carry on with this conversation in Amman. It was very dense and fascinating. I feel like we will have to get back to this later. And have a lovely night, everyone.
You too. Thanks
or day, depending on where you are. All right. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you, Reem. There, see, you are still. So now.
Let me end the meeting.